us is the executive director of the New Jersey chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, Jim Seuss. Thank you for joining us. Your initial reaction to Trump's statements calling for the ban on Muslims entering this country.
I'd have to agree with Governor Christie on this one. It is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's offensive, and it's frankly probably very illegal.
Donald Trump has said a lot of controversial things. Might these most recent comments be a tipping point of sorts where he'll start dropping in the polls?
Yeah, I would hope so. Right now, I'm not necessarily optimistic. I am very interested in seeing what the polling data will show will be the reaction to this. Trump has proven himself to be rather adept at abusing Muslims in the media and capitalizing on that in terms of political points.
How does the political climate surrounding the San Bernardino shooting and the Paris attacks play into anti-Muslim sentiment?
Well, it does play directly into that. Unfortunately, a lot of people will see those attacks as reflective of Islam and Muslims in general, and not see that this really is a case of some people in the Middle East who have political ambitions, who have perverted the religion, and some other misguided individuals who have bought into that perversion. It reflects very poorly on all Muslims, unfortunately. And it's created a very toxic political climate.
Has Donald Trump uncovered underlying Islamophobia in this country and somehow reignited it?
I think that's what's happened. By the level of support that he's received at every turn when he has upped the rhetoric on against Muslims, we see that his support not only doesn't decrease, but actually in some cases increases. And that is definitely a reflection on sort of some underlying Islamophobia that existed there all along.
What's at stake here, Mr. Seuss, in conflating the actions of ISIS militants with the Muslim population in general?
Well, yeah, what's at stake is the safety and security of American Muslims, because when you start conflating the barbaric acts of ISIS on all Muslims, especially American Muslims, you'll find people who will take it upon themselves to react in a way that is very harmful to Muslims. There have been cases of violence against individuals, violence against mosques, and threats against individuals and mosques as well.
Other Republican candidates have called out Trump on his comments, and there is widespread outrage from Muslims all over the country. But what's been the reaction of Muslims in New Jersey?
I'd say, widespread outrage. I mean, it's outrageous. It's offensive. It's hard to believe. I find it hard to believe that he was sober when he made these comments. It's just so over the top.
How do you combat this?
Well, the best way to combat this is for American Muslims to reach out to their friends and neighbors and co-workers and introduce themselves and introduce the religion and let them know that this is not something to be feared, not something to be suspicious of, and not something to hate, frankly.
There's been major outcry from political leaders, Republican and Democrat, from the president himself, but there is still a perception that the Muslim people aren't doing enough to combat this by raising their own voices. Do you agree with that?
I think that we have been doing quite a bit to denounce the actions of ISIS. There have been quite a number of press conferences and press releases by major Muslim organizations in the United States, and many of the mosques around the country have opened their doors to community leaders and to the press so that they could make it clear what their position is on the interpretation of Islam that ISIS represents and how perverted that is.
All right. Thank you, Jim Seuss.
Thank you.
The Council on American Islamic Relations is fighting back against comments presidential candidate Donald Trump made. The Republican claimed he saw New Jersey Muslims celebrating after the 9/11 attacks. CAIR leaders dispute that and say that there's no proof that ever happened. The national executive director of the group says American Muslims also mourned after 9/11.
We took out a full-page ad in the Washington Post expressing condolences, wishing speedy recovery for the injured, thanking our first responders, and calling for national unity in times of crisis.
CAIR leaders invited Trump and other GOP candidates to visit local mosques so they can learn more about the Muslim community.
New Jersey Governor Chris Christie today joining the bandwagon of mostly Republican governors, saying they will refuse to accept Syrian refugees. Governors actually have no legal say in this matter, but nearly 30 governors are now opposed. This as the Muslim community in the U.S. braces for greater scrutiny and fears of a backlash. Eyewitness News reporter NJ Burkett is in Monmouth Junction, New Jersey tonight with much more. NJ.
That's right, Liz. The Islamic Society of Central Jersey, where the imam says it's bound to happen. Increased surveillance and monitoring. And the growing controversy over Syrian refugees is fueling fears of a backlash against Muslim Americans.
Worshippers say it's inevitable. Increased surveillance of Muslims throughout the area.
I'm a man that deal with reality.
Some clerics, like Mustafa El Amin, say the carnage in Paris was so horrific, the implications so disturbing, that American Muslims should expect increased monitoring, if not welcome it.
The Muslim community is trying to do all that it can, but we most certainly need help from law enforcement.
But there are those who disagree.
So they have no reason to watch the Muslims unless they have probable cause.
At a news conference to condemn the attacks, local Muslim leaders say there are serious concerns about a backlash against their community. Atiya Aftab works with students at Rutgers University.
I know that the students who I work with on campus are certainly concerned that they could be victims of surveillance.
Some say an anti-Muslim impact is already being felt, with nearly half the nation's governors ready to turn their backs on Syrian refugees. Among the latest, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie.
I don't think orphans under 5 should be admitted into the United States at this point. I do not trust this administration to effectively vet the people who are proposed to be coming in order to protect the safety and security of the American people.
Critics say that's outrageous.
We find those comments reprehensible. I mean, it just demonstrates the lack of compassion on the part of our governor for even a 5-year-old orphan.
Christie says in light of the killings of 132 people in Paris, the state will not accept any refugees from Syria. Jim Suez is the executive director of CAIR-NJ, which stands for the Council on American Islamic Relations.
We find those comments reprehensible. I mean, it just demonstrates the lack of compassion on the part of our governor.
The terror attacks in Paris and then the attacks in San Bernardino, 2 terrifying events in the past month that have been both polarizing and unifying in some regards, both sparking a drastic shift in the public discourse in our country, in rhetoric, and in the tone of at least one presidential campaign. Events like these expose the truth, one, that we are indeed vulnerable, and 2, that fear can sometimes bring out the worst in people. Joining us now to discuss the anti-Muslim backlash is Abdul Mubarak Rowe, Communications Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, so talk about how you see the climate right now in the U.S. after Paris, after San Bernardino, where we're talking now about people who have been radicalized. Mm-hmm. Did you expect this type of anti-Muslim backlash so quickly? Was it something that you thought might come eventually?
To be quite honest with you, I felt that it could, because when we experienced September 11th, we kind of saw that kind of a backlash. And many of us were talking amongst ourselves that if another one of these types occurred again, it could get worse. And given that this is an election cycle, we knew that there might be those who want to take advantage of this particular crisis for their own self-serving political purposes.
In the past week alone, we've seen some pretty troubling events here in New Jersey, in Jersey City. There was a hate letter sent to a mosque there. Right. Of course, at the CAIR headquarters in Washington, D.C., there was a letter sent there with powder inside. Sure. And then there was a pig's head that was thrown at a mosque in Philadelphia. Right. When you see things like this, what goes through your mind, and what is it that you want to tell the public at large?
Well, it's a result of this sort of rhetoric that's been espoused for the past few weeks, or months rather, between Donald Trump, of course, but Ben Carson and others. And so it's a logical conclusion of that kind of rhetoric, hate and hate speech. And basically, we'd like to tell all American people, like, look, step back for a second. Get to know your Muslim neighbor. I think there was a poll that came out that the majority of Americans never even met a Muslim before. Well, get to know us. Get to us. You know, we're in basically every city in the country, especially here in New Jersey, for example. We have Muslims all over New Jersey. Get to know us. I think, and many of them do know us. And I think, in part, because they have gotten to know us as well as we have, and because of the outreaches that many Muslims have done in New Jersey, you don't have the level of backlash that you normally have in other parts of the country.
What you just mentioned a moment ago, you mentioned Donald Trump and his plan to halt Muslim immigration into the U.S. And, of course, that has sparked backlash not only amidst the Muslim community, but among others in politics. Listen, let's call it what it is. It's demagoguery. Is it Islamophobia?
It's Islamophobia. It's demagoguery. It also speaks to a history that I don't think America wants to revisit again. I'm talking World War II, Nazi Germany, when the Japanese were interned, Japanese internment camps and what have you, and when Jewish refugees who were fleeing Nazi Germany were barred from entering the United States at that time. I don't think America wants to go back to that. And no, I don't think America wants to go back to that. Simply put.
I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up, because somebody from the CAIR organization in Los Angeles, this was after San Bernardino was on the air over the past week, and I'm going to quote this. He said, "Let's not forget that some of our own foreign policy as Americans, as the West, have fueled that extremism," referring to what we saw happen in San Bernardino. Comments like that certainly don't help, do they?
You know, it's interesting. Robert Fisk, who was a reporter for the Independent, I remember he did a speech one time years ago. This was right after September 11th. And he was saying that everybody was asking the who, where, what, and when of what September 11th, but never asked the why. All right? And as uncomfortable as that is, he's spoken, the spokesperson at CAIR, California, he spoke an uncomfortable truth. Now, whether people were ready to hear that or not, that's one thing. However, let me just say, no, it's not about justification. We're not talking justification. Okay. No, this is a cause and effect. Okay, a cause and effect relationship. All right, it's not a justification, but it's part an explanation. Because understand, there are people who feel that because of America's foreign policy, and not just people who spoke of CAIR, but you had Defense Department officials saying the exact same thing in other parts, okay? Because one Defense Department official, I believe I recall, said something to the effect that the rhetoric that Donald Trump is speaking right now towards Muslims puts Americans in dangers and America's interest in dangers overseas. So there is a cause and reaction effect. There's a cause and effect that goes on here, right? So yes, we do have to be careful about what we say and what we do, because it does have an impact.
We're going to have to leave it right there. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your insight. We appreciate you sharing with us this today. It's Abdul Mubarak Rowe from CAIR, Council on American Islamic Relations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right, please.
Tonight, the FBI launching an investigation after at least 3 mosques were vandalized in California. The growing number of assaults targeting the Muslim community, now the worst since 9/11. Some are blaming escalating anti-Muslim rhetoric, including that from Donald Trump. Jason Carroll is out front.
American Muslims are becoming increasingly concerned about being targeted because of their faith. In the past few days, 3 mosques vandalized in California, 1 set on fire, a 23-year-old under arrest. In Philadelphia, a severed pig's head thrown at a mosque. And then there was this attack on Soccer Hawk.
I'm standing and he just like a minute or less, then he turning and he punched me in here.
Hawk owns a convenience store in Queens, New York. He says last Saturday, a man attacked him because he is Muslim.
He said, I kill Muslim. And then...
Wait, I'm sorry. He said, I kill
Muslim.
Is that how you got the black eye?
This is he punching.
Oh, so he punched you?
Then he punched me, I don't know how many times. I said, help, help, help,
This man, who did not want to be identified for his safety, heard those cries for help.
But the guy who was just angry, he just wanted to keep hitting them and keep hitting them until the cops came.
Hawk believes Donald Trump, who is from Queens, is partly responsible. Muslim leaders say Trump's recent plan to temporarily ban Muslims from the United States is part of a continued effort to demonize their faith.
This rhetoric echoes the policies enacted by Nazi Germany against the Jews. Trump's and Carson's mainstreaming of Islamophobia in the election is inciting real discrimination, real hate crimes.
Nihad Awad called out not only Trump and GOP candidate Ben Carson for his claim a Muslim should not be president, but also New Jersey governor and GOP candidate Chris Christie.
I think many Muslims in New Jersey feel a sense of betrayal for what Governor Christie has done.
Why betrayal? Many New Jersey Muslims thought Christie was an ally, but now disappointment over this comment from Christie about Syrian refugees.
I don't think orphans under 5 are being, should be admitted into the United States.
In the Republican primary campaign, Muslim bashing seems to be the red meat that the candidates are throwing to some of their supporters.
As for Trump, a new ABC Washington Post poll finds nearly 60% of Republicans support his plan. The frontrunner himself says he has support among the Muslim community.
I have many friends that are Muslims, and I will tell you, they are so happy that I did this because they know they have a problem.
But for Soccer Hawk, his problems are just beginning. He's on his way to speak to the district attorney, hoping his attacker gets the punishment he deserves.
And of course, so many of the Muslim American community have been trying to assimilate.
Yeah, and I will tell you something else. Despite what Trump says there, they are not happy about what he is advocating here. And some of the Muslim Americans we spoke to, Aaron, have been here for 3 generations. They so desperately want someone within the GOP field to really speak out in their behalf, and they're hoping that will happen tomorrow. But given the rate as things have been going so far, they really just don't have much hope at this point.
All right, Jason Carroll, thank you very much.
The Paris massacres led several Western nations to question their willingness to accept migrants, not least in the U.S. state of New Jersey. The state governor's among those demanding a halt to plans to take 10,000 Syrian refugees next year after Syria-based Islamic State said it was behind the Paris bloodshed. Many residents disagree.
Somebody needs to take care of them, otherwise they have no future, nowhere. And America is known for, having, giving them an American dream, giving them a chance to rebuild their life again.
We're a nation of immigrants. My grandparents came here from Albania two generations ago. They were refugees too. They were let in. We've done well here in this country. We can't close our doors.
Jim Sues is executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations New Jersey chapter.
The Syrian refugees are victims themselves, and they should not have to pay for the sins of ISIS as victims of ISIS.
House Speaker Paul Ryan says there's a Republican plan for legislation to pause the Syrian refugee program.
It calls for a new standard of verification for refugees from Syria and Iraq. It would mean a pause in the program until we can be certain beyond any doubt that those coming here are not a threat.
President Barack Obama is using his Twitter page to defend the refugee plan. He says slamming the door would be a betrayal of the nation's deepest values.
And joining us now to talk about the response of the Muslim community in America and here in New Jersey to Donald Trump's call for, quote, a total and complete shutdown of Muslim entering the United States is Jim Sues, Executive Director of the New Jersey chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Jim, welcome.
Thank you.
Jim, I have to ask you, first of all, when did you become a Muslim?
About 20 years ago.
How did that happen?
Yeah. I used to work for IBM. I had a coworker who was a Egyptian Muslim, and at one point we entered into a theological debate. The debate lasted over a couple of months.
You were a Christian?
I was raised Episcopalian. And essentially I lost the debate, though I don't consider it a loss, I have to tell you that.
Okay. Well, Jim, tell us from your personal experience and as the head of this organization, what's been the response by the Muslim community to what Donald Trump said, and what's been the effect on the Muslim community?
Well, it's kind of shocking, and it's disheartening. It does create tension and fear and apprehension in the community to think that a public figure like Donald Trump could say something like that. And there is a little bit of fear of backlash, and there has been some backlash I think that we can attribute to some degree to Donald Trump, though there have been some violent events lately that would contribute to that. But I think that when a person of that stature who's running for president sort of green lights that kind of thought and thinking, then we end up with the kinds of toxic atmosphere that we have now.
Yeah, so Jim, Ref and I, have been doing this for a while, and we made a decision journalistically, excuse me, a long time ago, we were not going to engage in watching the presidential race as people who do the horse race thing. So polls are taken, debates take place. We're at the end of 2015 as we do this program, moving into 16. Last poll I looked at, which is not about the race, but is more about public sentiment. 6 out of 10 people who say they're going to vote in the Republican primary agreed with Donald Trump's statement.
And his numbers went up, in fact, after he made the statement,
At
rather
that time,
than the other.
we don't know what's going to happen after that.
Yeah.
That's 6 in 10 Republicans who vote in the primary agreed with the statement. Says what to you?
No, that's a very disappointing statement about the.
Is that the word you want to go with,
life.
disappointing?
Well, it's.
Is it more than that?
Yeah, it's actually frightening. It's frightening. It's shocking. I mean, basically, his statement, what his proposal as far as banning Muslims, is ignorant on the face of it. It's not constitutional. It's probably not logistically feasible.
Is it un-American?
And it's un-American.
Is it against the Constitution?
It's against the Constitution.
So 6 in 10 people who say they're going to vote in a Republican primary are in favor of a position that is un-American, unconstitutional, not workable, and the reason you believe they are supportive of such a position is?
Well, if you strip all that away, about all that's left is bigotry. I mean, they are fearful and apprehensive about a minority in this country that are different, and they talk differently, they dress differently, they are of a different faith community, and the result is bigotry. Because
is it bigotry, or is it what you said earlier, which is a response to 2 violent acts?
Fear.
What you were talking about was the 2 terrorist attacks in Paris and San Bernardino,
right,
and it's fear. People are afraid. They don't have to be bigots to be afraid. They could be foolish and be afraid, right?
Okay, you could be foolish and be afraid, and it is, okay, so let's say it's foolishness.
And let's say it's because of the attacks, rather than, he added fuel to a fire that was already there.
He definitely fanned the flames of fire that was there. I mean, obviously, these feelings about Muslims in particular had to exist. I think that they may have been latent. I mean, obviously, there were people all along that had, I mean, there's been discrimination against Muslims for decades, and that's essentially why our organization exists. We wouldn't exist if that didn't happen. But now we can put a number on it, because you can take a proposal that is ignorant and see who will support that proposal.
But Jim, after 9/11, people were expecting this kind of thing to explode. It didn't. Americans actually didn't become, fearful. It didn't manifest this kind of thing after 9/11. And in fact, religious bigotry is mostly against Jews still, rather than Muslims in this country. So I'm wondering if it's because they're ignorant of what the Muslim community has done, and it's being done to the Muslim community by the terrorist himself, that the Muslims are the #1 victims of terrorism, that the Muslims have actually responded against terrorism in this country, but we don't hear much about it. I wonder if there's that ignorance.
Well, there's that, and we have many Muslims organizations, including CAIR, have gone out and held press conferences and issued press releases and condemned these acts in no uncertain terms. I think there's a big difference between what happened in the aftermath of 9/11 and what happened in the aftermath of these 2 latest attacks. And that is, after 9/11, George Bush and other politicians and public figures who people respect came out and said, we are not at war with Islam. We must be sure not to blame all Muslims for these acts.
That happened after Trump said what he did.
Right, but Trump still stood by what he said. And there are still other Republicans who are proposing ideas that are similar and making similar types of comments.
But there's been a lot of Republicans who have condemned him, even the head of Congress.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Ryan said it was un-American. It's not what the Republican Party stands for.
Right.
The Speaker of the House.
Speaker of the House. But here's the thing, in the limited time we have left. Where do we go from here? I mean, forget about presidential politics. Where do we go from here in terms of the relationship that most Americans want to have with the Muslim community?
What we need to do is create an environment where people are open to understanding the other. I think that American Muslims do make an effort to try and understand their American neighbors and partners, and it's up to the American people who are not Muslims to try and understand the American Muslims. There's actually, in some parts of this country, an effort to suppress that understanding. In some areas of this country, there will be a social studies course which will include the topic of Islam in the curriculum, and there are parents who are opposing that be taught and consider that indoctrination.
Can you understand the fear most Americans are feeling right now toward Islamic extremism?
I understand the fear. I understand the fear.
Can you understand it being directed at all Muslims and making that connection as illogical as it is? It's illogical and it's unfortunate. And I think that what we, besides the fact that the public on their own should overcome that fear and reach out and try and understand Islam, I think we do need the public figures who people look for their cues, like Donald Trump, Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, to stand up for what is right, what is American.
And can Muslim leaders do more in this country to set the record straight about where they stand, how they too are victims, and how they also oppose terrorism?
I guess they could do more. I see a lot of the effort. I don't think a lot of the American public necessarily sees the effort because it's not that, it's not as newsworthy as an explosion or.
I want to ask you one more thing. I know we've gone over time, but it's incredibly important. Could you see statements like Trump's and others who support his position of a total ban or even a close to a total ban on all Muslims coming into the United States, creating an environment that would allow more Muslims who would otherwise not be in a position to be
antagonistic,
radicalized, to use that term. I don't even like that, to radicalized, more likely being in a position to be radicalized because of this response?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is a possible equation that says that I've got a public figure and a number of people that are accepting that proposal, that follow that public figure, and the message is, you're not wanted, go home. And the message from people that try to radicalize American Muslims is, you're not wanted there, come home, come here, you're wanted here.
The answer is yes. You just said yes.
Yes, there's a slight possibility that there is that factor to the equation.
Which clearly would not be and could not be what Trump and others who support that position would ever want. And would never acknowledge that that would be a potential unintended consequence.
No, and another unintended consequence is that outside of the United States, America is now looking much less free and open and wonderful than it is.
Well, the Muslim community, many of them are speaking out this morning against terrorism, and they're also asking for greater understanding. We have two people who are joining us live in studio right now, freelance journalist Nidia Khan and Abdul Mubarak Rowe from the Council on American Islamic Relations. Thank you so much for joining us here live this morning in studio.
Thank you for
and
having
I
us.
think you can feel the tenor of what's happening. There seems to be this groundswell and movement of Islamophobia here in America, once again rearing its ugly head post 9/11. How would you two like to address it with us this morning?
Well, it's actually interesting. Just this week, the FBI released stats on hate crimes, and while they've gone down overall, they've actually gone up against the Muslim community. And I think we have to be really cognizant about how we shape these stories, about how we should be more careful about not putting all Muslims under the umbrella of terrorism. You got to remember, it's like 1.6 billion people around the world, and groups like ISIS and other terrorist groups are a tiny, tiny fraction of 1% of that. And unfortunately, Muslims, regular Muslims like Abdul and I, and a lot of other Muslims just don't get an opportunity to show our perspective, to show what true Islam is, and you have these other people who've hijacked the religion.
Okay, so let's talk about it. You talk about these extremists who have hijacked the religion. So set the record straight on how they've hijacked it and how you want other Americans who are watching today to perceive it.
Well, thank you for having me. And I would respond to that by saying that it's important that Muslims speak out with respect to explaining to the public exactly what al-Islam is and what it isn't. Just yesterday, we had a press conference, a group of Muslim leaders, and community members and activists in New Jersey, right, which your station was present at, decrying and denouncing the terrorist acts that are committed by people like ISIS, because ISIS, despite what they say to the contrary, they do not represent al-Islam in no shape, way, form, or fashion. And that has to be stated over and over and over again. But I would also like to caution the fact that the tenor of Islamophobia has been given a lot of height and rhetoric due to the pronouncement by some who are aspiring for political office as well.
Well, let's talk about your reaction to Governor Chris Christie. I think that's what you're alluding to. Are you alluding to the fact that he is talking about what is going on with Syria and saying close the border to Syrian refugees?
In part, yes, and I find that to be very unfortunate because these are refugees. And also bear in mind the fact that America has a far more stricter vetting process with respect to receiving refugees than the other European nations are, because most of the refugees are coming in from Eastern Europe, okay? And so those borders are open. So it is quite plausible to some extent that you would find maybe some refugees, you know, some terrorists maybe mixing in with the refugees and whatnot and coming in.
Well, that's what happened just right now in Turkey, and we saw that 8 people have been detained. They came in with refugees, and we also know that some of these people who might be involved in what happened in the terror attacks in Paris might have come in through the wave of refugees from Syria. So the vetting out process, like you said, hasn't been there. But there hasn't been a vetting out process that has been stated by the American government to ease the public's concerns.
Well, let me respond to that, and first by saying that I was just reading in the Guardian newspaper today, and the New York Times, as a matter of fact, also that stated that many of these passports that you found on those bodies were fake passports, which has been an agenda by ISIS to prevent people from from being refugees and coming into other countries, all right? So you have that kind of dynamic working. But America has a far more stricter vetting process, okay, in place right now than those other countries do.
Right. And I think it's also important to remember that the UN Commission on Refugees said that more than half of the refugees that are being pushed for resettlement here in the U.S. are actually children, are actually under a certain age. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, because a lot of these kids are orphans who have nowhere to go.
Let's go back to Governor Chris Christie. He said he doesn't want anybody, even orphan children, because there's no one there to take care of them. Well, is this what we were founded on as a country?
No,
absolutely not. Or do we need to change our process, because there is this tenor, and there is a nervousness that's in the country right now, especially after the veiled threats by ISIS that they will attack Washington, D.C., and that there are sleeper cells that are here in America, and there are known hotbeds within this country, and we know those known hotbeds.
And you know what? And I think ISIS, we should all just be very cautious, because it's exactly what ISIS wants, right? They want
holy
this division.
War.
Well, they want this, exactly. They actually put out something in February after the Charlie Hebdo attack saying that they want to get rid of the gray zones, which are basically the middle point where people come together and have mutual understanding and mutual respect, and they want that eliminated. So this is exactly what they want, pitting people against one another and then recruiting from there and getting more people on their side. So
and
we
also,
should be very careful.
Yes, I'm sorry. And also, it plays into the whole narrative of what they want with respect to denying America its value systems. This is not what America is about, all right? Because if we give in to the terrorists, we are achieving their agenda by doing so. So we play into their fears. So I would ask the American people not to give in to the exacerbated fears that have been produced by some political operatives who wish to further their own political goals, nor to give in to the fears that are pronounced by ISIS.
And we'll let that be the final answer. We thank you both for joining us, freelance journalists Nydia Khan and Abdul Mubarak Rowe from the Council on American Islamic Relations.
Thank you.
It is 7:20.